I'd like to welcome you all to our session, and we truly appreciate having you here in this session. This session is themed Green Trade and Africa Policy Perspectives, and it has been organized by Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, that's CIATINI, in partnership with Third World Network Africa under the umbrella of Africa Trade Network. Allow me to introduce our panelists so that we know them and we can be able to differentiate them by name as the discussion goes on. On my immediate left is Mr. Sylvester Bagoro. He works with Third World Network Africa, and he's a development economist with over 15 years of experience in policy research, analysis, and advocacy in Africa in the areas of multilateral, regional, and bilateral trade, investment and finance regimes, and Africa's political economy. He's worked on these issues and their implications on Africa's structural economic transformation and integration over the years. The approach has been from a political economy perspective with a particular focus on Africa's location in the global economic order as dependent on primary commodities. He's currently a program officer within the political economy unit of Third World Network Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to invite Mr. Sylvester Bagoro to share with us on existing economic weaknesses as part of our session. And I'll be inviting other speakers to also contribute to other focus areas of the discussion.
Thank you, Herbert. Thank you, everyone, for coming. As you said, this session is trying to explore some of the issues that can make Africa, in terms of climate, resilient. And so my input will focus on the weaknesses of African economies, and then the other areas will handled by Jane and Ambassador. And as you said again, I work with Third World Network Africa. We're based in Accra, Ghana, and we're happy to be here. Let me start by saying that the topic green trade and Africa policy perspectives. Let me begin by saying that Africa's position or African economic challenges are related to two main things. The first one is its position and location in the global economic order. That's the first one. So if you look at the challenges that we have in Africa, if you trace them, they are linked to how we are located in the global economic order. Secondly, the internal effect of the domestic capacity that we have in Africa. So these are the two main challenges that you can find. I mean, how they define our location in our economic challenges. Let me start with the first one, our location in the global economic order. It is actually very important because talking about green transition, we need to understand where we are located in the global economic order so that we can appreciate some of the concerns that we put forward in these global spaces. A glance at Africa's trade basket reveals that its export is made up of raw materials, whether from the minerals or agricultural products. And this has been an enduring feature of African economies over the decades. So that has been the export basket of Africa. So the continent is inserted in the global economy as a producer of raw materials. In fact, in some studies, you saw Africa as a signpost for raw materials. I mean, that has been an enduring feature. Again, if you take a look at African economies, they are dominated by transnational corporations. Of course, we have small and medium enterprises littered all over the continent, but we have the dominant players that are transnational corporations, whether in the services sector, especially also in the extractive sector. You have a number of them. And let me just say that there has been a qualitative shift in the control of raw materials as compared to the post-independence time. Immediately after independence, government could control their resources. Raw materials could control them. But over the decades, that kind of control has waned. And so TNCs have much more control over raw materials across the continent. On the other hand, if you look at the import basket, I'm still on Africa's location in the global economic order. If you look at the import basket of Africa, it reveals the importation of value-added products ranging from agricultural products to manufacture products and even services. And most import bills are rising, and you can see a lot of import flooding African economies, so that has been mostly manufactured, and even some of the low products that we could manufacture on the continent. So all these are flooding the continent. And that is about the first point about Africa's location in the global economic order. The second point about the internal dynamics, what I call the internal dynamic effect. Let me say, internally, we have what I call weak linkages between the sectors. Agriculture is not interacting meaningfully with the manufacturing sector. And so you have, take, for instance, produce. Are you talking about cocoa in Ghana? You are talking about coffee in Uganda? You are talking of flowers in Kenya? Or you are talking about diamond and all the things? They are externally linked to the external markets. And so we produce the cocoa, and then it's linked to external market. The cash crops are actually the market is external. Of course, we have some level of processing on the continent, but a chunk of these products are actually lifted out of the continent. In the services sector, we have that is actually externally oriented. Take the finance, for instance. Getting finance into the most critical productive sectors in the continent is a problem. But if you are looking for credit to import things, that you can get. But trying to get credit into agriculture and other stuff is a challenge. So that is another dimension of the future of African economies. Now, that brings me to the second point, that all these actually paint a weak productive capacity within the continent. And it flows from the lack of structural economic transformation that we have on the continent. As most of you might know, that structural economic transformation path entails a steady reduction of the weight of the rural economy, and industrialization push built around rising productivity in the manufacturing sector and tied to an expanding urban economy and a strong linkages among the sectors. When the sectors interact, that is where you can have a very good, dynamic economy. So when the sectors do not interact and they are linked to external markets, then it creates problems in terms of job creation, in terms of the stability of the economy. It's very, very, very important. So what is the implication? Let me look at it at two levels. Number one, livelihood issues. It actually affects how Africa responds to livelihood issues on the continent. But much more importantly, in the context of climate change, in the context of energy transition, how we can respond to the challenge of climate. I mean, the picture I have painted, affects how we can respond to the climate, and how countries are called upon to green development is very, very, very important. But of course, to address all these challenges I have painted, you need a number of policies, what I call a package of policies, to be able to deal with them. And I'll just run through a number of them. One of them is, climate-friendly investment policies. In a continent where you have a lot of TNCs and you have a lot of transnational corporations that I mean by TNCs, you have a number of SMEs. How do you have an investment rule? We have investment rules that can actually factor in all the power play among all these actors to get optimum results for the continent. That is one. So you need an investment rules that are responsive and they respond to the reality confronting the continent. Secondly, you need technology policies that are climate friendly, and of course at the level of the WTO and also at the level of the regional level. Very, very important. And the third one, you need a finance policy that actually allows what I call the intermediation function of finance. Finance is supposed to serve the real economy and the productive sectors, not the other way around. Finance is supposed to serve, it's supposed to play an intermediate function, get into the real areas where we need finance, not the other way around. And so that's another kind of policy that we need. And of course, we need trade and industrial policies that support the transformation of green industrialization. Let me say at the moment, there are initiatives for structural economic transformation in Africa. I mean, the picture I painted it's not like the hopeless situation. The continent is taking a number of initiatives that will actually transform the continent. In fact, I've been saying in this forum that the challenge of climate in Africa is actually a challenge of economic transformation. If African economies are not transformed, we cannot deal with the climate question. And so these initiatives will be the focus of my next speaker. And so I don't want to run ahead. I'll allow the next speaker to take us through some of the policies that the African governments are putting in place in order to transform, and then see how best we can infuse, the greening of those policies on the continent. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sylvester Bagoro, for elucidating on our location in the global economic order and also setting the pace for the discussion. Before I invite the next speaker, allow me to first introduce her. On the extreme right is Ms. Jen Nalunga, who is an expert on trade, fiscal, and investment-related issues. She has vast experience and expertise in analyzing national, regional, and international trade, investment and fiscal-related agreements and policies, and how they interact with key development dimensions such as climate change, gender, human rights, and food security. She has more than 20 years of experience in policy research, analysis, and advocacy, and has authored a number of policy-oriented studies and articles. She has substantial experience advising government, civil society organizations, private sector, and policymakers on a range of trade-related issues. She's currently the Executive Director of Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, CIATINI, which is a sub-regional NGO operating in Eastern and Southern Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Ms. Jen Nalunga to share her perspectives. But she'll be sharing perspectives on existing initiatives, the point that the previous speaker, Mr. Sylvester Bagoro, ended on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair. And thank you so much, my fellow panelists, to be here. I'm happy to be in such a distinguished company. And thanks also to all of you for taking time to come to our panel discussion. As the Chair has pointed out, I'm going to talk about the initiatives in Africa when it comes to green trade and also to the issue of Africa's structural transformation. The previous speaker, Sylvester, has ably analyzed the challenges facing Africa and the imperative for Africa's structural transformation. In that context, I think for Africa, energy transition, when we talk about energy transition, it's not simply replacing of maybe a dirty source of energy with a cleaner one. When we talk about energy transition in Africa, it's deeper. It's a fundamental question of development, of structural economic transformation, in which we address the dependence, the commodity dependence, and also the need for industrial transformation from that agrarian-based economy. So it's against that background that I'm just going to give you just a few of the policy frameworks we have on the continent and how these frameworks are trying to deliver on this ambition of structural transformation. First of all, Africa has an initiative called Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. This is Africa's strategic framework that's aimed at delivering its goal on inclusive and sustainable development. It's rooted in the Pan-African vision of an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa, driven by its own citizens. And when you look at the Agenda 2063, it clearly addresses the need to shift away from commodity dependence. This Agenda 2063 has identified a number of flagship programs which can boost Africa's economic growth in order to lead to a rapid transformation of the continent. These key flagship program include one, the Africa Mining Vision, the Continental Free Trade Area, the Accelerated Industrial Development of Africa. There are many initiatives on the continent, but I will just analyze two of them, especially the Africa Mining Vision. The Africa Mining Vision was adopted in Africa in 2009, and its goal was to create a transparent, equitable, and optimal exploitation of mineral resources to achieve a broad-based socioeconomic growth and transformation. It's concerned with how minerals can be able to contribute to Africa's structural economic transformation through mineral beneficiation and manufacturing. It charts a path for generating and realizing various types of linkages arising from the mineral sector. From the previous presentation, the presentation clearly brought out the fact that Africa has been exporting its other commodities, agriculture, mineral commodities. So the AMV, its major concern was that the minerals are beneficiated and they are also linked to other sectors. The Africa Mining Vision also looked at the issue of the artisanal miners to ensure that they also benefit, but also issues of the environment and environmental rights and community rights. The AMV, the Africa Mining Vision, rose out of Africa's realization that if the mineral sector is effectively harnessed in Africa, it can be a real game changer. And this is because of the fact that Africa is home to a significant quantities of minerals which are needed for the energy transition and the green industries. Because when you look at platinum, cobalt, copper, lithium, Africa has it. So the Africa Mining Vision was about harnessing all these abundant clean energy resources for her structural transformation. But the Africa Mining Vision was also a blueprint on how to navigate the resource scramble. Because what's happening today in Africa is another kind of scramble for Africa's minerals. The US, the EU, China, so the issue of navigating that is a key challenge facing Africa. But again, the Africa Mining Vision, it was a strategy to chart a different path to avoid a replay and a deepening of the primary commodity export dependent. Because what's happening is that there is a fear in Africa because Africa has been exporting commodities. The fact that all these critical strategic minerals are there and people who want them are from outside, that it would continue, deepen that commodity dependence and increase the export of raw materials from Africa. So there is that initiative in place, a very good initiative, but it also has a number of challenges. One, there has been a very slow implementation of the Africa Mining Vision. In fact, when you look at it, 14 years down the road, there is a general lack of this vision at respective national levels, and there are very few countries which have adopted it by putting in place country mining visions. In the absence of a robust framework on minerals, on the mineral sector, Africa is still lacking a coherent policy and agenda for addressing energy transition and also of harnessing opportunities presented by the energy transition. This is not to say that there are no initiatives in Africa to be able to add value on our minerals. There is an example, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia have gone into a regional battery and electric vehicle value chain. So there are those isolated initiatives, but collectively there is a lot which needs to be done. The AMV is in place, but it has some gaps. One other gap in the Africa mining vision is the issue of stranded assets. Stranded assets are those assets, for example, the oil, the gas, the coal, and other fossil fuels, which are at stake when we are talking about the transition to clean energy. They are going to become stranded assets. What do we do about them? This question hasn't been addressed in Africa, even under the Africa Mining Vision. Briefly, Chair, allow me to say something about the Continental Free Trade Area. The Continental Free Trade Area is, I think, one of the largest free trade area in the world, because it brings together 55 African countries, 8 regional economic groupings, and the mandate of the the CFTA, the Continental Free Trade Area, is to bring Africa under one single continental market, but also to be able to promote intra-regional trade and also regional value chains, and also promote structural transformation. So when we talk about structural transformation, the initiative, the Continental Free Trade Area as an initiative, is very critical for the continent. And the Continental Free Trade Area is also trying to promote the regional value chains in especially in the energy transition sphere. However, the CFTA is also facing challenges internally, but also from outside. Internally, the CFTA has concentrated a lot on liberalization of trade instead of looking at the productive capacity, and also the link between the CFTA and the green energy transition is still very weak. Therefore, in my conclusion, Africa's challenge today is no longer just about structural transformation, which is already an uphill task, but it's also about greening that structural transformation. Because today we are talking about not just industrialization, but green industrialization, greening of value chains. And I think this will require overhauling our initiatives, our policies to strengthen those linkages. And for Africa, I think we need a deeper rethink, a deeper analysis of the key continental frameworks in place, and to be able to analyze where they are fit for purpose. Because when you look at what's on table, that link between our minerals, climate action, green recovery is a bit tenuous, and it needs to be strengthened. The previous speaker talked about a number of policies which need to be put in place. Issues around technology transfer, we have them. We have industrial policies, we have investment policies. In fact, we have a continental investment protocol. But that link between these policies and the green transition still needs to be addressed. So there is a lot which needs to be done internally in Africa, but the external environment, the external policies are also critical. Most external policies have not been very supportive for Africa's structural transformation, if I may say so. Currently, in the implementation negotiation of the CFTA, for example, the EU, the European Union, is negotiating free trade agreements, not just with Africa or even regional blocs, but individual countries within regional blocs, which is dividing up the continent. The European Union, when you look at the free trade agreement is signing with Africa, there are provisions like limitations or prohibition of export taxes, which is really export taxes. Restricting export taxes is very critical if a country is to industrialize and to add value. And when we are talking about the green transition, it's important that we retain the raw minerals within Africa and add value to them. So that's just an example of those external policies which are impacting negatively on Africa's quest for structural transformation and green energy transition. And there are others, and I think the ambassador will be able to talk about what needs really to be done within the WTO and maybe the free trade agreements, how they can be able to support Africa's structural transformation and green energy transition. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Jane Nalunga, for that elaborate sharing. I think from what you've shared, a lot has been touching on existing initiatives, and even in the presence of such initiatives, there are a number of issues that are not playing out well for Africa's structural transformation. And Africa's quest for structural transformation has been crippled by a number of factors, both internal and external. And in the face of the energy transition, still we are yet to find solutions on how we can transform as Africa, but also build climate resilience. And the next speaker on my immediate right is Her Excellence Zolora Mulumbi Peter, who has served as South Africa's Chief Negotiator, Deputy Director General in the International Trade and Economic Division at the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition since October 2014. She has led South Africa's trade negotiations with various partners, including the European Union, United Kingdom, Macosa, and in several multilateral platforms such as G20, BRICS, and Commonwealth. Her Excellence Mulumbi Peter joined the DITC as Director, NEPAD/African Union in September 2005 and was appointed as the Chief Director for Africa Multilateral Economic Relations in May 2008 to drive regional economic integration in Africa. She's an accredited Center for Effective Dispute Resolution Mediator, and in 2021 served as the Chair for the TRIPS Council of the WTO. In her current role as the Ambassador to the WTO, she has been active in advancing the interests of the Africa Group and developing countries broadly on WTO and trade-related issues. So, Ambassador is going to speak to whether the WTO as the only multilateral international organization has the solutions and how WTO rules can support Africa's green transformation. Distinguished participants, let's welcome Ambassador to share her perspectives with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Herbert, and thank you to Jane and Sylvester also for their inputs. I start from a perspective that Africa actually can provide solutions to many global challenges that we currently face. We are blessed by the Almighty with many resources, raw materials, the sun, the wind, the water, everything that needs to solve many challenges, whether you are talking the environment, you are talking issues of digital and high-tech products. But for us to be able to reach the potential that Africa has, we require fair trade rules. And the WTO has a role to play in that regard. And we need fair and mutually beneficial trade and investment relations with a lot of our partners that we trade with. And I think if we can work in partnership to forge those mutually beneficial relations, then you will see most of the issues that relate to the global commons solved by Africa. There's a tendency to look at Africa as, a continent that is full of challenges and all of that. Yes, the challenges are everywhere. And yes, the challenges are in Africa, but the solutions are also in Africa. I think if the world can change its perception on how it relates to Africa, then many challenges, as I said, can be solved. The context of the WTO, I think, one, if we want to ensure that there is fairness and Africa can contribute to, and take its rightful place in terms of inclusive growth and development, one, we need to address the long-standing imbalances in agricultural rules. What we have is an agreement on agriculture that actually gives special and differential treatment to developed countries, which is an anomaly in the WTO, because special and differential treatment should be for the reserve of developing countries. You have a situation where developed countries, and of course a few developing countries, including South Africa, have access to aggregate measurement support above the de minimis that countries can provide. And that support, because of the huge pockets of developed countries, they are able to concentrate that support to specific products, displacing developing country farmers, not only in the international market, but also in their domestic market, because they cannot compete with huge subsidies from developed countries. And the subsidies, when it comes to agriculture, I know there's a buzz about fishery subsidies. The subsidies in agriculture are approaching $1 trillion per annum. So this is a serious challenge, especially now that we are sitting with a food security challenge. So for us, we do believe that MC13 must quickly deliver a credible food security and livelihoods package that should have 4 components. 1, disciplines on agricultural subsidies. 2, a permanent solution on public stock holding so that countries are able to provide for their domestic food security needs. 3, a special safeguard mechanism to deal with volatility in terms of prices and also import surges. And then, of course, the worst unfairness and injustice relates to cotton, where the Cotton 4 have been calling for years for a decrease in cotton subsidies, so that at the end of the day, you can have a thriving clothing and textile regional value chain in Africa that will ensure that we are able to provide for our own needs. So that's on the one part on what we need to do in the WTO to ensure that there's fairness and we are able to ensure that Africa is able to green its trade. Agriculture is critical to greening trade. 2, we need to define a development-oriented approach to the trade and climate nexus. This must not only advance the interests of a few, but must take into account the need to decarbonize the global economy, but do it in a fair and just way. What we currently see is implementation of unilateral, punitive, protectionist measures that are implemented under the guise of the environment. This, again, would mean that even though we have, in the case of the EU, for example, if you look at CBAM, we have a reciprocal trade arrangement where we have given concessions, of course, on the basis of asymmetry, gotten concessions also from the EU. Now, with the CBAM, those concessions are not going to be effective because there is another barrier that we need to cross to access the EU market. So what is going to happen is that our exports and the competitiveness of our economies and our products is going to be affected. So we really need to take a developmental approach, multilateral cooperative approach to find a solution to how we deal with the trade and investment nexus. I won't repeat what I said in the previous session for those that were there. 3, we need an investment-led cooperation agenda. What this means, and I think it links to what both Jane and Sylvester spoke about, the structural transformation of the continent. As I said, we are blessed by God with critical raw materials that the world needs in order to advance the decarbonization of the global economy. What we see, as Jane has said, is another scramble for Africa. A scramble that leaves Africa again in the lower end of the global value chains when it comes to green industrialization is not going to be a solution. If we want to find sustainable solutions, we need investments in Africa to add value to African resources in the continent and to build regional value chains. I sometimes hear trading partners saying, yes, we understand what you are saying, and of course it makes sense. However, some of the countries that are having these minerals, there are conflicts. So they are not stable, so it's not possible to really build, manufacturing capacity in these countries. And I'm saying Africa has 55 countries. Do you mean we cannot find countries in Africa where these value chains can be built so that at the end of the day we can promote real development in Africa? So, as I said, an investment-led cooperation agenda is the third issue that we need to look into. 4, industrialization has come back to the mainstream. And we do believe strongly, as the biggest proponents, even before it became the buzzword. Again, in the WTO, we've been agitating as South Africa and as the Africa Group for trade rules that are supportive to industrial development and trade rules that support the structural transformation of the continent. Of course, it was seen to be, about just advancing, nationalism. But it's strange now that we see it from the other side. The biggest proponents of industrial policy are developed countries, because the same vulnerabilities that we've been raising, that we have been saying Africa is experiencing for a long time, now the developed world is realizing that concentration of production in a few countries is creating significant risks for many countries. And if we are to build resilience, then we need to diversify, manufacturing of key products. We saw this in the context of the pandemic, where there was concentration of production of vaccines. The South and Africa, in particular, was left in the back of the queue because, of course, we are majority importing our vaccine needs, in fact, all the medical needs. The same thing happened with agriculture. With what is happening between Ukraine and Russia, it was clear that there's concentration of production when it comes to fertilizers as well as grains. So we are now affected again in the context of food. Same thing with regards to semiconductors. We realize that there's concentration of production. So clearly, if we are to ensure that we are able to build resilience for future crises, the issue around diversification of production and addressing the issue of concentration of production is an absolutely important issue. So we've been saying as the Africa Group, there's a need to have a framework in a multilateral setting where we can look at how we rebalance trade rules and recalibrate trade rules to provide policy space and key policy tools that governments need to, at a national level, to address their challenges. But of course, we do recognize that if you don't do it within a multilateral framework, what is going to happen is that it will lead to fragmentation, which is what we are currently seeing, because now developed countries are actually unilaterally taking this policy space, are implementing increasing subsidies to the disregard of their commitments in the WTO, implementing local content requirements to the disregard of the WTO rules. And what is happening actually is that those policy tools are now available to the biggest players. You have a global trading system that is now being advanced on the basis of power dynamics rather than fairness. And we are saying there must be fairness. Let's have a framework where we agree and recognize that these policy tools have been useful in the process of industrialization of those industrialized countries. And that now, in the context of the poly crisis, we are also finding use to these policy tools to deal with the policy crisis. So let's now put a framework where we allow for a managed, and I think the point that was made by former Prime Minister Gordon Brown when he was talking about the seismic shifts, and he was talking about managed globalization. I think we need to get to that point. In fact, I think he took exactly what we've been saying as the Africa Group into his speech. Because what we are saying is that you need to come up with a framework. This framework must allow the policy tools. If I take, for example, we have identified as the Africa Group, and for those who have not read the submission, it's in WTGCW 868. That is where we outline the policy trust of what we mean by policy space, and where we identify specific agreements within the WTO toolbox that will need to be recalibrated in order for us to then provide for this policy space for the transformation of the continent, but also green industrialization. And of course, it is supported by specific papers where we are making specific and targeted proposals on how these rules can be rebalanced. And there are three agreements that we have identified. Agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures is the TRIPS agreement, and of course issues related to technology transfer, and the third one is the TRIMS related to the issues on local content requirements. So we are saying, if you look at the menu of the options that we have, let's look at what worked in the past and see how we can bring it back, starting with the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. You'll recall that as one of the outcomes of the Uruguay round, we had Article 8 on non-actionable subsidies, where it was recognized that governments would need to use subsidies, of course in a targeted manner, to advance their legitimate policy objectives, including in relation to issues of the environment, research and development, technology upgrading, but it was a limited dispensation of 5 years. We are saying, when we are faced with the poly crisis, it is important to look at how we can bring that policy tool back into the mainstream so that governments have the space to be able to respond into addressing the global challenges that we face. With regards to TRIPS, I think it has been very clear in the context of the pandemic, in the context of food security, in the context of climate change, that we need to have a mechanism and an effective working mechanism that promotes effective transfer of technologies in a balanced way, that recognizes, in line again with the TRIPS agreement, that IP must be protected for the benefit of the producers of IP, but it must also be protected for the benefit of the users of IP. How we find that balance is going to require, of course, a lot of discussion among members, and we are again, as the Africa Group, saying the existing market mechanisms are working, and they should be encouraged. Your voluntary licensing agreements, they are working, should be encouraged. However, we also have to recognize like we have recognized in the context of the pandemic, that there are cases where there is market failure. And when there is market failure, we really need to find a mechanism where we incentivize the private sector to transfer the requisite technologies at affordable and accessible ways. So that is the discussion that we believe is critical so that we are not faced again with another pandemic or even crisis and we don't have response mechanisms in our disposal. The third agreement that we have identified is, as I said, the TRIMS and the need to look at how, in line with what I've said with regards to an investment-led cooperation arrangement, how we can incentivize domestic manufacturing in Africa. And that would require promoting local manufacturing, and it requires using local content requirements as one of the tools. And we see it working in the context of, the U.S. is using it in the context of the IRA, and we are saying, if it is good, of course, for the developed world, why would it be bad for the developing world? So let's have fairness, level the playing field, have a framework where you give these policy tools to also those that need it. The only difference that we see, of course, if you don't have a framework, is that if you look at the IRA, for example, when it comes to battery manufacturing, 50% local content must come from the USMCA. By 2030, the plan is to increase that to 100%. What is going to happen to trade? Fragmentation of international trade. So we are saying, let's have a discussion around a threshold that will be acceptable to all of us, where you allow the local content, but also ensure that you are able to still promote international trade. So really, as I said, we have, as the Africa Group, been active in terms of making specific proposals, because we don't want a ideological debate around policy space that we've been having in the WTO. We really are hoping that we can move to real solutions that will actually ensure that we have a system that works for the benefit of all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Just to reflect on the earlier perspective insights that you shared, how you gave us hope that Africa has potential to actually solve her own problems, but also to contribute solutions to solving global challenges. But also the emphasis on the need to promote fair and mutually beneficial trade and investment relations, as opposed to punitive and restrictive measures. I think that's loud enough for all of us to hear. And thank you to you and the other ambassadors under the Africa Group for putting forward really a number of good proposals that can be championed on the road to MC13, especially where you talk about the need to rebalance and recalibrate trade rules to provide for adequate policy space, because it's important for us to even achieve industrialization, and how we need to look in the past to see what worked, to adopt the same, bring back the same, in order to be able to cross over from where we are to where we want to be. But also the need for effective transfer of technology cannot be overemphasized, striking a balance to benefit those who invent the technology, but also the other people that need to be benefiting from the same. That balancing act is what I think collectively we need to discuss and reach at. And the need to incentivize the private sector can also not be overemphasized. Incentivizing domestic manufacturing in Africa is also key, but also using some of the policies that we have, investment policies, to have provisions for local content, joint ventures, and the rest, to enable us to be able to benefit from the different provisions. And the need for a level playing field can also not be overemphasized. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for sharing much more on what needs to be done in order to achieve structural transformation, but also to address the poly crisis, because it's in our midst, and collectively we need to find solutions to the poly crisis. So I think from the panelists, the speakers, a lot has been shared, and I believe that you distinguished participants have some comments and some questions that they could further elaborate on. So now I invite all of us to contribute to the discussion? We could raise up our hands as a sign of interest to contribute to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentations that you have made. I think it's important in any context to have a sort of a balanced perspective on things. And I think in many ways, my experience this week has been that there's this perception of Africa as needing to be helped, as opposed to perhaps creating a level playing field or creating an environment for accountability of actions by, different actors, different stakeholders who are represented here. So my question is, and I think I particularly agree with your sentiments, especially Ambassador. I think I would just want to put a mic drop on your presentation, but I also want to understand. So my question is for understanding. The first thing is on which provisions have you found specifically, okay, maybe that's a bit too technical, but some examples of provisions that are making it easier for some countries to get away with certain conduct which developing countries cannot make use of. So the WTO has provisions, has rules, but it also has exceptions, so things like your domestic subsidies, things like the CBAMs. I want to understand, how is it that the EU can use CBAMs, for example? Because from a layman's perspective, it seems like that violates the objectives of the WTO, right, in a way. So I think that would be my main question. And then also, is there a way within the current framework that developing countries can tap in? It sounds like asking, breaking the rules in order to benefit from the rules. I don't know if my question makes sense, but yeah, just for understanding purposes.
Thank you. We could take all the questions. Yes, Alexander.
Thank you so much, Ambassador and distinguished panel, for the insight about the African perspective. That was very interesting indeed. My name is Alex Fischer. I'm a director at Climate Works Foundation, which is a U.S. foundation. My role as a guest in this policy forum is, obviously in our community, people ask themselves, with the shift which is recognizable with the WTO, should we invest in the work here, and are there opportunities, possibilities for our, coming from the side, if you want to call it that way, for our small money and budgets to push and to help things forward on the climate agenda, because it's climate change. I clearly hear you in the sentiment you have on the initiatives taken in the US and EU and maybe even China, India. They have their own, but not so visible, and they are obviously not so much expanded yet in the world. But and also the last days I experienced how should I say, the attitude from EU and US, so I fully understand your points of view. Nevertheless, I'm asking myself then, what can I bring back to my community? What should I say? Are there openings where we can engage and where we can support you in the work without creating new walls and more walls which are already there, but really try to get them out of the way and get the things done? There was the African Climate Summit, and very impressive. AU came up with a push for the market initiative. I think that's very strong. So definitely we're going to support there, and we see the potential in making things happen, especially also since China is supportive on markets, and nobody can say no to that. So let's see how long it takes, but nevertheless there's this opening. And I'm listening to you. Of course, I hear the points of thresholds, and this may be something which we can work on and really help you to sort of make it very clear. If you guys don't met this, it's hard for us to move to the next level and discuss environmental standards while you're breaching so many on the other side, right? I mean, why would we do this? Fully understand. But then the question is, what is the time frame for that, right? Are there things where we can push really, the next 1 to 3 years, let's say, and would be delighted to bring something home, if you want to call it that way.
Thank you so much. Please.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Sophie. I come from the Norwegian youth environmental organization named SEED. And I've been looking a bit into the WTO law on the CBAM and possibilities for preferential treatment of countries in relation to it. And I've found that, and it's also being discussed on the public forum, that there are possibly ways of giving preferential treatment, especially to LDCs, maybe SIDS, but also potentially other developing countries. And my question for you is that a viable way? Do you see it as something helpful, or is it a way of using the same framework that created the problems initially and is a part of the unfair power structures of this organization? So yeah, would you see it as helpful? Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions, comments, contributions? We could actually answer all those questions.
Hi, I'm Jane Maloney from South Africa. I have maybe two questions. Can I ask two questions? The one is around the trade in intermediate goods in Africa. We've seen a growth in the Congo, in the DRC, and in Morocco and in Egypt. But in South Africa, we've seen a little bit of a drop. Does this mean that the others are catching up? Of course, the growth in intermediate goods is a first step in the right direction. And the reality is that Asia and Europe and then North America, but Asia and Europe have the highest trade in intermediate goods. So this could be an area that we could focus on. So yeah, that's the first sort of comment. Then the second one is around IP. I was going to ask around intellectual property. Ambassador, you talked to you need it protected for the benefit of producers of IP, but you also need for the users. Do you have any practical, tangible ideas around this? And also the WTO, some people see it as moribund, old, unable to change. Do you think there's political will within the WTO organization to change? So sorry, I asked far too many questions. Maybe just answer the last one.
Thank you. Do we have more questions, comments? Addendum?
Addendum, annexure, protocol, as we tend to do. Maybe I can direct this to Ms. Jane. Is there any room for women in this conversation, and how would you position that? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I think without further ado, allow me to invite Ambassador first because she got really a good share of questions. Ambassador, over to you.
On the question around, maybe let me start with the last questions and then move the way up. On the issue of whether there is political will to change, for a long time the WTO has been, especially on issues of development, I found it to be an organization that doesn't appreciate the fact that you have 2/3 of the membership who are developing members. And of course, at some point we attempted after the global financial crisis and we came up with the Doha development agenda and development round. But it quickly, we are quick to forget and move on, like we are now quick to forget and move on when it comes to the issues of the pandemic and the need to solve these issues in a more sustainable way. Now, of course, what you see is that, as again I'll draw from Prime Minister Brown's intervention, what you see is that there's recognition that the system, yes, has contributed. There's no doubt that the trade rules and the predictability that come with trade rules have contributed to boost international trade. However, we also cannot question the fact that the benefits have not been shared equally, both within countries and between countries. So increasingly you're seeing that even within developed countries, there's recognition that the current system has left people behind. You have a rise in inequality, a drop in living standards, and now there's increasingly recognition. And, it was actually eye-opening to hear the U.S. repeating many times the importance of going back to really delivering on the principles that were agreed to in the preamble of the WTO, boosting living standards, increasing employment, promoting sustainable development. So I do believe, and I'm generally an optimist, I do believe that there is a new political will, at least that is emerging. Whether it will be delivered quickly, I think, knowing the WTO will take time in doing things, because, of course, you have 164 members that must reach consensus for us to move. But I do believe that there's a new window of opportunity that has opened to really have these discussions, both on policy space, because now even developed countries recognize the need to have policy space. In fact, to even have a discussion on policy space in the WTO was like a swear word. Now it is coming to the mainstream. In fact, on 25 and 26 September, we are having a specific discussion in a retreat format on trade and industrial policy. That's a new for the WTO. So of course, maybe also taking the point from the gentleman from the U.S., I think where you can help us and where I think there is a window of opportunity is to really look at how, because sometimes we tend to discuss issues on the basis of South and North, developed, developing. Increasingly, we are now dealing with global challenges, issues of global commons that affect us regardless of where we are. So it will be good to look at how we can position the conversation in a way where it's about the global good and the recognition that we need to act together, cooperate together for the global good. And, of course, in that global good, and I think there was also a question about special and differential treatment and whether the flexibilities are working. You will, in whatever conversation, you will have to recognize that we are at different levels of development. The tendency, though, in the WTO, and I think sometimes there's a bit of a lack of appreciation, especially from developed countries, and, of course, the China question always comes up as well, that we are at different levels of development and that we really need to ensure that within the rules there are inbuilt flexibilities that are effective enough to allow developing countries to make these commitments, but also ensure that they have space to maneuver in making the commitments. Because what we've held, which is why the issue of flexibilities has not worked in the past, because yes, you do find in all the WTO agreements flexibilities. In fact, again, as part of the Doha round, there was agreement to review and these flexibilities to improve them, to make them precise, effective, and operational. Because there was recognition that most of the flexibilities that are supposedly there, either they were temporary, as I've said, with regards to the agreement on subsidies, 5-year dispensation, and most of even because you have two provisions that we are looking at in terms of the Africa Group proposal. One is the non-actionable subsidies, Article 8. We are also looking at how we can refine Article 27, which is where the S&D flexibilities are. In terms of Article 27, again, you had a limited transitional dispensation of flexibilities that have expired. So we no longer have access to those flexibilities at a time we need them the most. So that is where the difficulty is. 2, some of the flexibilities are put in best and ever language. So developed countries do not feel that they have an obligation because it's best and ever. So you need to really tighten those to really ensure that they have a level of account. I think someone referred to accountability. They have a level of accountability in terms of really assisting developing countries to be able to develop. So really it's about the right to development. We are not looking for favors. We are not looking for charity. We're looking for fairness in roles. The third point is whether the Africa Group is united. The Africa Group, of course, like any big group, if we are all honest, there are challenges. One, because of capacity constraints of members, because many of the missions in Geneva are not only dealing with the WTO. You only have South Africa and Nigeria that have supplementary to the UN mission. They have specific WTO missions and WTO ambassadors and teams. So the two countries are relatively well off in terms of following the agenda and what is happening in the WTO, which is why you'll find them being more active in the WTO. However, others are overstretched because beyond just looking at the WTO and the UN institutions, they also are dealing with bilateral responsibilities, including Vienna, and Rome. So, of course, the resources are spread too thin. But in terms of the policy trust and the agenda that is linked, as Jane has said, to advancing issues here that assist us to achieve our agenda in terms of Agenda 2063 and the AFCFTA, there's no question about African unity. We, of course, in developing the submissions, go through a thorough interrogated process within the Africa Group where we question each other, we criticize each other, and then ultimately we settle towards a submission that we put forward. So the submissions that you've seen, whether on environment, whether on the policy space, whether on agriculture and domestic support and cotton and SSM, including the coalition with the coalition of developing countries, ACP, G33, and the Africa Group on PSH, it comes as a result of that unity. Of course, more could be done, but I do believe that we are able to, even as I've indicated with the Africa Group G33 ACP, not only able to consolidate unity within the Africa Group, but also to see how we can build a coalition of developing countries on issues of particular interest. And of course, even in the case of the TRIPS waiver, it was the Africa Group at the forefront. The proposal, of course, was started initially by India and South Africa, but the Africa Group quickly joined. And then thereafter, we were working with a coalition of countries that took us to 65 co-sponsors, but support from over 100 countries. So we are able to leverage all of those. So on the issue of trade in intermediate goods, as I end, there was also your question. Okay, on the issues of the trade in intermediate, I think this is the way to go. You are correct, Jane, which is why we are saying building regional value chains is important. Actually, you always hear about the low level of intra-Africa trade, and people will quote the 16 or 18% and how low it is compared to other regions. But when you interrogate the figures, you will see that intra-Africa trade is in value-added products, intermediate and sometimes finished products. And that is actually the more beneficial type of trade. It may be coming from a low base, but at the end of the day, it's the meaningful trade that we need in terms of addressing our own developmental objectives, including dealing with issues of job creation, especially since we have a young population. Lastly, on your question around CBAM and giving S&D to developing countries and whether this is a solution. It's a difficult question. But I think for me, we need to first interrogate it because once you say S&D, it means you've accepted that this is the right way to go. We are coming from a premise that punitive approaches to trade are not the solution. Actually, they lead to more fragmentation than enhancing and strengthening the rules-based multilateral trading system. So I think we probably need more debate now before, of course, we know that from the 1st of October there are these reporting requirements. But I think we need more debate now with the EU and, of course, a number of countries that are looking at establishing CBAMs to really look at whether we cannot find least trade restrictive mechanisms that will contribute effectively to the decarbonization of the global economy. Because, as I said in the morning, UNCTAD study shows that there will be a lot of disruptions when it comes to international trade from CBAM, but very limited contribution to actual reduction of greenhouse emissions. It only contributes 0.1% to the reduction of greenhouse emissions. So you bringing a big gun to kill a fly. I'm not saying climate change is important, huge, needs to be resolved. For me, I think given the magnitude and seriousness of the issue, let's find a solution and solutions that will actually, yes, contribute effectively to climate change, but in a manner that ensures that we are not having more unintended consequences than we wanted to have. So maybe more discussion at this stage on finding a better solution before we talk about, of course, SND. And of course, even if we get to SND, it has to be effective, precise, and operational. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I would request that you give your final message, because when I turn to the rest of the speakers, they'll also be sharing their final messages, since our time is not our friend now.
I think let me leave it at that. I think that would cover what I would have wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thanks for the comments coming in. And thanks also, Ambassador. That was really very helpful. I will just add on to some of the issues which Ambassador has raised. The issue of the WTO being old and unable to change. For me, my take on this is that the WTO is what we have, the multilateral, which is adjudicating over the multilateral trading system. And if we are to look at the global governance, that's the WTO, what we have. And for me, I think when you look at the global challenges we are having, we need global institutions where all of us have a say, have a voice. WTO, UN are very, very critical. And I think we need also to look at it in terms of the entire global governance, not just for trade, but also for the financial architecture, for the debt. So for global challenges, we need global institutions to address that. And we're in one meeting, and somebody was saying, instead of talking about EU Green Deal, why don't we talk about a global Green Deal, so that we can be able to address those issues globally. Another issue about the Africa group being weak, or how strong it is here. For me, I think the Africa group is as strong as the capitals are strong, because the ambassadors here get support and input from their capitals. And what I have realized, Siatini, we do work with our government. Sometimes we on government delegation most often, and back home we do work with the ministries. And what we have realized is that the ministries are very weak. The ministries are not coordinated. Today we are talking about climate change, trade, the linkages, but back home, the Ministry of Trade is on its own, Ministry of Energy on its own, Ministry of Environment on its own. You know, when we go to a ministerial conference, we don't have a common a common position as common integrated position. Way back, I remember there was a program called GTAP it was made of WTO, ITC, UNCTAD to help build platforms at national level, to bring actors together to have a common position. It's no longer there. And I think that's also a challenge when it comes to Africa's participation in these negotiations. Already, our offices here are weak, sometimes one person, two people, yet there is also no support from the capitals. And this brings me to the issue of the push for a climate agenda. I think the push has to be related to what's happening at national level, regional, continental, and global level. Because what we demand for in the WTO should come from the lower levels to make sense. It has to be applicable. So when we talk about special and differential treatment, it has to resonate with what's happening at national and regional levels. So when we are talking about climate change issues and how to do the linkages and what to demand for Africa's position at the WTO level, it has to come from below. And that's why it's important at national level, at regional level and continental level to bring the actors together, the trade, the industry, investment, energy, environment, finance. We need to be together. And this has been under the women agenda. They all have to be together. And this is what has been happening. When we talk about energy transition, we have been working on these issues of climate change, energy transition. But even in our parliaments, you have to go to different committees, totally isolated. So we need a common platform. We need to bring ideas together, but it has to be a bottom-up to make it really workable at the global level. Lastly, when it comes to the issue of women, of course women have a say, because when we look at all these challenges, the crisis, the climate crisis, it affects women, the rural women. They are more vulnerable. And we are talking about inclusiveness and leaving no one behind. So women have a table. And lastly, my last comment really is that there is a need for a rethink, a need to overhaul our policies right from the national level, the regional level, the continental, the global level. And we need to be able to come together and be able to defend what we want. I have been having challenges with working our governments on CBAM, because just the information on CBAM in our ministries and governments is not there. But even how to position ourselves to be able to interact with the European Union, that capacity is not there. So building capacity, having information to be able to understand what's going on, making the linkages that if we are to in trade, what do we want to demand? What kind of trade policy do we need for the energy transition? What kind of investment policy should we put in place? So to go on. But yesterday we were in a meeting on technology transfer. The issue has been coming up that we need technology transfer to transition. But I remember when we were in Doha, the working group on technology transfer was put in place. Doha was in 2001. Since then, nothing has been done. But I understand, Ambassador, that the technology working group is now, it has been revived. But somebody was saying that, no, maybe we need to look at technology transfer broader, outside the WTO, looking at how we can be able to design our investment policies to attract investments through joint ventures. So there is a lot of thinking and rethinking to be done. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you so much, Ms. Jena Lunga, for those great insights. On my left is Mr. Sylvester Bagoro.
No, the time is up. We have actually responded to most of the issues apart from what Michelle was talking about. We can talk one-on-one, but time is up, yeah.
Thank you so much. I would like to, first of all, thank the speakers, the panel here, for the great deliberations and insights, but also to you, distinguished participants, for your contributions, great comments and questions. Thank you. And definitely the conversation is not stopping here, because really we've opened a can of worms and, they are scattered all over. So we have to follow them. And on the road to MC13, we invite you all to keep engaging on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.